The woman in the corner wasn't supposed to be there. She stood perfectly still, hands folded, watching the crowd of donors and socialites swirl around the charity dinner like she was studying specimens behind glass. Her tailored black suit screamed money, but her eyes screamed something else entirely. Something that made people step away without knowing why. The whispers had already started. Who does she think she is? So arrogant. Doesn't even try to mingle. But across the room, a man in a borrowed tie was watching too, his 8-year-old daughter tugging at his sleeve, and he saw what everyone else missed. He saw the slight tremor in her fingers, the way she pressed her lips together when someone laughed too loudly, the careful distance she kept, not from superiority, but from something that looked suspiciously like fear. What he didn't know yet was that in exactly 17 minutes, his daughter would accidentally change everything. And the words he'd speak, in a language none of these people expected him to know, would reveal a truth that would make every assumption in that room crumble like paper in rain. David Parker adjusted his tie for the 3rd time, feeling like a fraud in the borrowed suit jacket the grand ballroom of the Renaissance Hotel, buzzed with the kind of energy that came from people who wrote checks with more zeros than most folks saw in a year. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in white linen, where conversations flowed as freely as the top-shelf whiskey being poured by servers in pristine uniforms. "Daddy, why is everyone dressed like they're going to a wedding?" Grace whispered, her small hand gripping his calloused fingers tighter than usual. At 8 years old, she possessed the kind of honesty that could cut through adult pretenses like a hot knife through butter. Because sometimes when people have important things to talk about, they like to dress up for it. David replied, scanning the room and immediately regretting their decision to attend. The invitation had come through Grace's school, something about recognizing families who'd shown resilience in tough times. The guidance counselor had been insistent, mentioning scholarships and opportunities, and David never could say no when it came to Grace's future. But standing here now, surrounded by people whose monthly car payments probably exceeded his rent, he felt every callus on his hands, every grass stain on his work boots he'd tried unsuccessfully to buff out. The woman in the corner caught his attention, not because she stood out, but because she seemed to be trying so hard not to. While everyone else moved in clusters, air-kissing and name-dropping, she remained statue-still against the far wall. Her black suit was immaculate, her dark hair pulled back in a perfect chignon. But there was something in her posture that reminded David of Grace on her first day at a new school, all courage on the surface, uncertainty underneath. "She looks sad," Grace observed, following his gaze with the directness that made David both proud and terrified of what might come out of her mouth next. Before David could respond, the conversation at the nearest table drifted their way, carried by the kind of voices that were used to being heard. "That's her, the tech CEO," a woman in diamonds was saying to her companion. "Sarah something. Chinese, I think. Or Korean. You know how they all look the same." David's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. Grace's hand found his again, her small fingers intertwining with his larger ones in a gesture that had become their silent code for "people are being mean again." "I heard she donated $2 million to the cause," the companion replied, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "But look at her just standing there, doesn't even try to socialize. So typical of their culture, all business, no warmth." The irony wasn't lost on David. Here they were, at a charity dinner supposed to bring people together, and the person who'd contributed the most was being dissected by people who probably donated enough to write off on their taxes, but not enough to actually make a dent in their lifestyle. He'd seen this before, the casual racism dressed up in cocktail party politeness, and it never failed to make his stomach turn. Grace tugged on his sleeve again. "Can we go say hi to the sad lady?" "Grace, we should probably—" "Please, Daddy. She looks like she needs a friend." And that was Grace in a nutshell. 8 years old, and already more emotionally intelligent than half the adults in the room. David looked across the space again, watching as another group of potential conversation partners approached the woman, exchanged a few words, then drifted away with barely concealed expressions of confusion or irritation. Whatever was happening over there, it wasn't going well. The evening's host, a silver-haired man in a tuxedo that probably cost more than David's car, tapped the microphone at the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you could take your seats, we'll begin tonight's program." David guided Grace toward their assigned table, somewhere in the middle, safely anonymous. But his eyes kept drifting back to the woman by the wall. She hadn't moved toward any of the tables, hadn't even picked up the program that detailed the night's agenda. Instead, she stood there with the kind of stillness that comes from years of learning how to make yourself invisible when the world feels too loud, too fast, too much. As the lights dimmed and the presentation began, David caught sight of her profile in the glow from the projection screen. Her features were delicate but sharp, like someone had carved them from marble with careful precision. But it was her eyes that held his attention. Dark and intelligent, but carrying a weight that seemed disproportionate to someone who should have had the world at her fingertips. The presentation droned on about educational initiatives and community outreach, the kind of carefully crafted slideshow designed to make wealthy people feel good about opening their checkbooks. Grace fidgeted beside him, her attention span stretched to its limit by corporate speak and statistics. When the lights came back up for the dinner portion of the evening, she immediately turned back toward the woman by the wall. "She still looks sad, Daddy. And she's all by herself." David followed her gaze and felt something twist in his chest. While everyone else had settled into animated conversations over the first course, the woman, Sarah, he'd heard someone call her, remained standing, now holding a plate of untouched food like a shield between herself and the rest of the room. Her isolation was so complete, it seemed to create its own force field, pushing people away before they even got close enough to try. "Maybe after dinner we can," David started to say, but Grace was already up and moving, her natural fearlessness overriding his adult caution. "Grace, wait." But she was already weaving between tables, with the determined stride of a child on a mission. David hurried after her, catching apologetic glances from other diners as his daughter navigated the room like a heat-seeking missile aimed directly at the most untouchable person in the building. Sarah noticed them coming, of course. David could see her shoulders tense slightly, her grip on the plate tightening as she prepared for whatever awkward interaction was about to unfold. He'd seen that look before, the expression of someone who'd learned to brace for impact every time another human being approached. Grace came to a stop directly in front of her, tilting her head back to meet Sarah's startled gaze. "Hi, I'm Grace. You look like you could use a friend." For a moment, Sarah just stared at her, as if Grace had spoken in a foreign language. Then something flickered across her features. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something unexpected. "Hello, Grace," she said softly, and David was struck by how different her voice sounded from what he'd expected. Gentler, warmer. "I'm Sarah." "Are you here by yourself?" Grace asked with the kind of directness that made adults squirm, but somehow felt perfectly natural coming from her. "Yes," Sarah admitted. "I suppose I am. That's sad. My daddy says nobody should have to eat fancy food alone. It makes it taste weird." Grace gestured toward David, who had finally caught up and now stood slightly behind his daughter, ready to apologize for whatever social boundary she might be about to cross. Sarah's eyes met his for the first time, and David felt something electric pass between them. Not romantic exactly, but a kind of recognition. Like looking into a mirror and seeing not your own reflection, but someone who understood what it felt like to be perpetually out of place in a world that seemed designed for everyone else. "Your daughter is very kind," Sarah said, and there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't used to unexpected kindness. "She has a gift for finding people who need it most," David replied, and immediately felt foolish for the presumption. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to suggest that you need—" "I do," Sarah interrupted quietly. "Need it, I mean. More than you might think." Grace, oblivious to the adult undercurrents swirling around her, reached out and tugged gently on Sarah's sleeve. "Do you want to sit with us? Our table has extra chairs, and I can tell you about my butterfly collection." For the first time since David had noticed her, Sarah smiled. A real smile that transformed her entire face. "I would like that very much." As they made their way back toward David's table, he couldn't help but notice the ripple of whispers that followed in their wake. Heads turned, eyebrows raised, conversations paused mid-sentence as people processed the unexpected alliance between the mysterious CEO and the obviously out-of-place father-daughter duo. "Interesting choice in dinner companions," someone murmured as they passed. "Wonder what she wants from them," came another voice. David's jaw clenched again, but Sarah seemed either oblivious to the comments or well-practiced at ignoring them. She settled into the chair Grace indicated, with a gracefulness that suggested she was used to being watched, used to having her every movement scrutinized and catalogued for future judgment. "So," Grace began without preamble, "what kind of work do you do?" "Daddy fixes cars, which is super cool because he gets to use lots of tools, and sometimes he lets me help by holding the flashlight." Sarah's smile widened slightly. "I work with computers and technology. My company makes software that helps people communicate with each other across different countries." "Like Google Translate?" Grace asked, her eyes lighting up with interest. "Similar, but more complex. We focus on helping businesses understand each other when they speak different languages or come from different cultures." David found himself leaning forward slightly, intrigued despite himself. It was the first time all evening he'd heard Sarah speak with any enthusiasm, and the change in her demeanor was remarkable. Gone was the carefully controlled stillness, replaced by something that looked almost like passion. "That sounds important," he said. "Must be challenging work." "It is." Sarah's gaze met his again, and he caught a flash of something that might have been gratitude for his genuine interest. People often assume that language barriers are just about vocabulary, but it's so much more than that. Cultural context, nonverbal communication, social hierarchies, they all play a role in how we understand each other. "Or misunderstand each other," David observed. "Exactly." There was something almost vulnerable in the way she said it, as if he'd touched on something she'd been thinking about all evening. Grace, meanwhile, had finished her analysis of Sarah's explanation and moved on to more pressing matters. "Do you have any kids?" "No," Sarah replied, and David caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "No, I don't." "That's okay. Some people are too busy for kids, or maybe they're waiting for the right person to have them with. My daddy was married to my mom, but she died when I was little, so now it's just us. But we're pretty good at taking care of each other, aren't we, Daddy?" David felt heat creep up his neck. Grace's casual revelation of their family situation always caught him off guard, especially in social settings like this, where single parenthood seemed to come with its own set of assumptions and judgments. "We are," he agreed softly. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying both of them with an expression David couldn't quite read. When she spoke again, her voice was gentler than it had been all evening. "You're very lucky to have each other." "We think so," Grace said matter-of-factly. "But sometimes I wish Daddy had more friends. He works a lot and doesn't talk to many people except for me and sometimes Mr. Rodriguez, who owns the garage." David wished he could disappear into the floor. His 8-year-old daughter had just essentially announced to a stranger that he was a friendless workaholic with no social life. Which, to be fair, wasn't entirely inaccurate, but still wasn't something he needed broadcast at a charity dinner. "Grace," he started, but Sarah held up a hand. It's okay. Friendship can be complicated when you're an adult, especially when your circumstances are different from most people's. She glanced around the room, taking in the clusters of animated conversation, the easy familiarity between people who moved in the same social circles. Sometimes it feels easier to just focus on what you can control. There was something in her tone that made David suspect she wasn't just talking about him. Before he could respond, though, the evening's host had returned to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored tonight to have several special guests who have made significant contributions to our educational initiatives. I'd like to invite Sarah Chen, CEO of Global Bridge Technologies, to say a few words about the importance of cross-cultural understanding in education. A spotlight swung toward their table, bathing Sarah in brilliant white light. David saw her stiffen, her hands gripping the edge of the table as hundreds of eyes turned in their direction. The casual warmth that had been growing between them evaporated instantly, replaced by the same careful control he'd noticed when she was standing alone by the wall. I should go, she said quietly, more to herself than to them. You've got this? Grace whispered with the fierce confidence that only children possess. Just talk to them, like you talked to us. Sarah looked down at her for a moment, something unreadable passing across her face. Then she stood, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the podium with the kind of measured grace that spoke of years of practice moving through hostile territory. David watched her go, already dreading what was about to unfold. He'd seen enough workplace presentations, enough community meetings, to recognize the signs. The room had that particular energy that came when people had already made up their minds about someone, when they were waiting not to be convinced but to have their existing prejudices confirmed. Sarah reached the podium and adjusted the microphone with steady hands. When she began to speak, her voice was clear and professional, but David could hear the slight tension underneath. Thank you for having me tonight. As many of you know, Global Bridge Technologies focuses on breaking down communication barriers between cultures and countries. We believe that education is the foundation of understanding, and understanding is the foundation of peace. It was a good opening, clear, concise, relevant to the cause they were supposedly all there to support. But David could already see the problem. Sarah's presentation style was different from what this crowd expected. Where they wanted emotional appeals and personal anecdotes, she was giving them data and logical arguments. Where they expected the kind of performative warmth that came naturally to professional fundraisers, she was offering genuine passion, filtered through a more reserved cultural lens. In our research, we've found that 87% of international business conflicts stem not from genuine disagreements, but from cultural miscommunication. She continued, simple things like eye contact, personal space, and the directness of language can create misunderstandings that escalate into major problems. David found himself nodding along. It made perfect sense to him. He'd seen similar dynamics play out in smaller ways at the garage, where customers from different backgrounds sometimes clashed with mechanics over communication styles rather than actual service issues. But looking around the room, he could see that Sarah was losing her audience. Conversations were starting at nearby tables, phones were emerging from purses, and the general energy was shifting from polite attention to barely concealed boredom. That's why our scholarship program focuses not just on language acquisition, but on cultural competency. Sarah pressed on, either unaware of or choosing to ignore the growing restlessness. We're not just teaching children to speak different languages. We're teaching them to understand different ways of thinking, different ways of being in the world. Excuse me, came a voice from one of the front tables. David recognized the woman who'd been gossiping about Sarah earlier, her diamond earrings catching the light as she turned toward the podium. This all sounds very academic, but what I'm hearing is a lot of theory and not much heart. Can you tell us something personal, something that shows us why this matters to you? It was a reasonable question, the kind that any experienced public speaker should have been prepared for. But David watched Sarah's face and saw something that looked like panic flicker across her features. Her hands gripped the sides of the podium tighter, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its steadiness. What matters is the data. The research shows clear benefits to cultural education programs, and our pilot initiatives have demonstrated measurable improvements in cross-cultural competency among participants. But why do you care? The woman pressed, and there was something almost predatory in her persistence. What's your personal connection to this cause? Help us understand why we should trust you with our donations. The room had gone completely quiet now, all pretense of polite multitasking abandoned, as everyone waited to see how Sarah would respond. David could feel the tension building, could see the way Sarah's composure was starting to crack under the pressure of being asked to perform emotional vulnerability for a room full of strangers who had already decided she was too cold, too foreign, too different to be trusted with their money. My personal connection, Sarah repeated slowly, as if the words themselves were foreign to her. The work speaks for itself. The outcomes demonstrate. We don't want outcomes, another voice interrupted. We want to know who you are. Why should we believe you understand what American children need when you seem so disconnected from American values? David felt Grace tense beside him. His daughter might only be 8, but she had finely tuned antennae for when adults were being cruel to each other. He put a protective arm around her shoulders, wishing he could somehow shield Sarah from what was happening at the podium. I'm sorry if I seem disconnected, Sarah said, and for the first time, David heard something like hurt creeping into her voice. I've lived in America for most of my life, but I understand that my communication style might be different from what you're used to. In my culture, we often express care through actions rather than words, through dedication to excellence rather than emotional displays. Your culture. The diamond earringed woman latched onto the phrase like a weapon. So you admit you don't consider yourself American? It was a trap, and everyone in the room knew it. Answer yes, and she'd be accused of being a perpetual foreigner who could never truly understand American needs. Answer no, and she'd be called a liar for having just referenced cultural differences. David watched Sarah stand frozen at the podium, caught between impossible choices, and felt something hot and protective surge through his chest. Around them, the whispers were starting again, louder now and less concerned with discretion. I knew there was something off about her. $2 million doesn't mean anything if she's just using it to push her own agenda. Typical. They come here and expect us to adapt to them instead of the other way around. Grace's small hand found David's larger one under the table. Daddy, she whispered. They're being really mean to the nice lady. David squeezed her fingers gently, his mind racing. He could stay silent, let this play out however it was going to play out, and take Grace home to their small apartment where they could pretend none of this had happened. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice for a man who had learned to keep his head down and avoid drawing attention to himself and his daughter. But looking at Sarah's face, seeing the careful mask she wore starting to crumble under the weight of casual cruelty disguised as concerned questions, David realized he couldn't live with that choice. Not when he knew something these people didn't, not when he had the power to change the entire trajectory of this evening with just a few words. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor loud enough to draw attention. Grace looked up at him with wide eyes, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Around the room, heads turned in his direction, curious about the disruption from the clearly out-of-place man in the borrowed suit. David walked toward the podium with steady steps, his work boots echoing against the polished floor. He could feel the weight of hundreds of stares, could hear the murmur of confusion spreading through the crowd. Who was this nobody? What did he think he was doing? When he reached Sarah, she looked at him with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been hope. Up close, he could see that her hands were trembling slightly, though she kept them carefully controlled at her sides. "Excuse me," David said into the microphone, his voice carrying easily across the now silent room. "I'd like to say something, if that's all right." The host looked confused but nodded, probably too surprised to object. David turned to face the audience, taking in their expectant faces, their barely concealed impatience with this unexpected interruption from someone who clearly didn't belong. "My name is David Parker," he began, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I'm a mechanic. I fix cars for a living, and I'm here tonight because my daughter's school thought it might be good for us to see what real generosity looks like." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room, making eye contact with as many people as he could. "But what I've seen instead is a woman being attacked for the crime of being different, for not performing emotion the way you expect her to, for not fitting into your narrow definition of what American looks like." A ripple of uncomfortable shifting went through the audience. The diamond-earringed woman started to interrupt, but David held up a hand. "You want to know her personal connection to this cause?" David continued. "You want to know why she cares? Maybe the question you should be asking is why a woman who's already contributed more money than most of us will see in a lifetime feels like she has to justify herself to people who've decided she's not good enough before she even opened her mouth." He turned slightly toward Sarah, seeing the shock in her eyes. Then he did something that made the entire room go completely silent. He spoke to her in fluent Japanese. "Sarah-san, anata wa hitori janai. Watashi ga wakatte imasu." "Sarah, you are not alone. I understand." Sarah's eyes widened, her carefully maintained composure cracking completely. She responded without thinking, the words tumbling out in her native language. "Doko de Nihongo wo naratta no desu ka? Naze?" "Where did you learn Japanese?" "Why? Nihon de hataraite imashita, 5 年間. Anata no kaisha de." "I worked in Japan. For 5 years. At your company." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stared at him, recognition dawning in her features. "David Parker. Toyota no Kojo de. You were the American engineer who helped design the cultural integration program." David nodded, switching back to English so the rest of the room could understand. "I worked at the Toyota plant in Nagoya for 5 years. Sarah's company, Global Bridge, was contracted to help foreign employees understand Japanese workplace culture. Their program didn't just teach us language, it taught us respect. It taught us that different doesn't mean wrong." He turned back to the audience, seeing their confusion, their struggle to process this unexpected twist. "While I was there, I watched Sarah present to rooms full of skeptical executives, just like she did tonight. I watched her break down barriers that had existed for decades, helping people understand each other across cultural divides that seemed impossible to bridge." Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her face as years of careful emotional control finally gave way. "I remember you," she said softly into the microphone. "You asked the best questions. You understood what we were trying to do." "Because I was an outsider too," David replied. "I know what it feels like to be judged for being different, to have people assume you don't belong before they even get to know you." He faced the audience again, his voice growing stronger. "This woman didn't just donate $2 million to your cause. She created the educational framework that's being used in schools across 3 continents. She's personally mentored over 200 young professionals from underrepresented backgrounds. And she did it all while dealing with people like you questioning her right to exist in spaces she'd earned through intelligence and hard work." The room was dead silent now, the weight of David's words settling over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Even the servers had stopped moving, frozen in place as they watched this unexpected drama unfold. "You asked for something personal," David continued, his voice rough with emotion. "How about this? Sarah Chen spent her own money to fly to Japan when my wife was dying. She helped me navigate the Japanese healthcare system, translated for me during the worst moments of my life, and made sure I could bring my wife home to die surrounded by people who loved her. She did that not because she had to, but because she understood what it meant to be lost in a foreign place when everything was falling apart. Grace had appeared at his side somehow, slipping through the crowd with the determined purpose that had brought her to Sarah's corner in the first place. She took Sarah's hand in her small one, offering the kind of uncomplicated comfort that only children can provide. "The reason Sarah seems distant to you," David said, his voice growing quieter but somehow more powerful, "is because she's spent years having to prove herself to people who decided she wasn't good enough before she walked in the room. She's learned to protect herself by keeping her emotions private, by letting her work speak for itself. But that doesn't make her cold. It makes her careful." He looked directly at the woman who had been leading the attack. "You want to know what American values look like? How about judging people by their actions instead of their accent? How about recognizing generosity when it's standing right in front of you? How about having the grace to admit when you've been wrong?" Sarah stepped closer to the microphone, her voice still shaky but growing stronger. "David is right. I do keep my emotions private. In Japanese culture, we show respect through restraint, care through dedication. When I see a problem, my instinct is to solve it, not to talk about how it makes me feel." She paused, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. "But maybe I've been so focused on not being too much that I forgot how to be enough. I've been so afraid of being seen as the cold, calculating Asian businesswoman that I stopped letting people see who I really am." The transformation in the room was palpable. People who had been hostile minutes before now looked uncomfortable, ashamed, some openly emotional as the reality of their behavior sank in. The host cleared his throat, stepping forward as if to regain control of the evening. "I think we owe Ms. Chen an apology," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "And our gratitude, not just for her generous donation, but for her patience with our misconceptions." A smattering of applause began somewhere in the back of the room, growing stronger as more people joined in. But Sarah held up a hand, stopping the applause before it could build momentum. "Thank you, but what I'd really like is to start over," she said. "To tell you about the program we're funding and why it matters. Not because I'm trying to impose my culture on anyone, but because I believe children deserve to grow up in a world where being different isn't seen as being wrong." She looked down at Grace, who was still holding her hand with the fierce loyalty that had become her signature. "This young lady taught me something important tonight. She didn't see my expensive suit or my foreign name or my uncomfortable body language. She saw someone who looked sad and decided that wasn't acceptable. That's the kind of thinking we want to encourage in our children. The ability to look past surface differences and see the human being underneath." The second half of Sarah's presentation was nothing like the first. Gone was the careful distance, the reliance on data over emotion. Instead, she spoke about growing up caught between two cultures, about the scholarship students she'd mentored who reminded her of herself at their age, about the moment she'd realized that her success meant nothing if she couldn't use it to make things easier for the people coming behind her. She talked about David's work in Japan, how he'd been one of the few Americans who'd truly embraced cultural exchange rather than simply tolerating it. She spoke about the day he'd asked her to help him understand the Japanese concept of ikigai, life's purpose, because he wanted to find meaning in his work beyond just collecting a paycheck. "That's what this program is really about," she concluded. "Not just teaching children to speak different languages, but teaching them to find their ikigai in building bridges instead of walls. Teaching them that understanding each other isn't just politically correct, it's the foundation of every innovation, every breakthrough, every moment of human progress we've ever achieved." When she finished, the applause was genuine, sustained, and came from people who were really listening for the first time all evening. David saw tears in eyes that had been hard and judgmental 20 minutes earlier. He saw people looking at each other with something that might have been shame, but also with something that looked like possibility. As the formal program concluded and people began moving toward the reception area, Sarah remained at the podium for a moment, looking out at the crowd with an expression David couldn't quite read. When she finally stepped down, Grace immediately attached herself to her side. "That was much better," Grace announced with the authority of someone who'd been critiquing public presentations her entire 8 years of life. "You sounded like yourself that time." Sarah laughed, a real laugh that transformed her entire face. "Thank you, Grace. You're an excellent critic. I told you she just needed a friend," Grace said to David with the satisfaction of someone whose predictions had come true. Over the next hour, something remarkable happened. People who had been avoiding Sarah all evening began approaching her, not with the superficial networking energy David had observed earlier, but with genuine curiosity and what appeared to be authentic contrition. Conversations formed around their small group, real conversations about cultural differences and educational philosophy and the challenges of raising children in an increasingly connected world. David found himself in the strange position of being Sarah's translator, not linguistically but culturally, helping bridge the gap between her more reserved communication style and the expectations of people who were genuinely trying to understand. It was work he'd done before, in different contexts, and he was surprised by how naturally it came back to him. "You know," Sarah said to him during a brief lull in the conversations, "I never properly thanked you for what you did in Japan. For my family." David felt heat creep up his neck. He'd hoped that particular detail might get lost in the larger story, but apparently Sarah's memory was as sharp as ever. "You didn't need to thank me. You helped save my wife's life, or at least made her last months more bearable. You visited her in the hospital every day for 3 weeks, even though you barely knew me. You brought her books in English and helped her practice physical therapy exercises. You made sure she wasn't alone when I had to travel for work." Grace was listening with the intense focus she brought to any story about her mother, storing away details about a woman she'd been too young to remember, but still missed with the fierce loyalty of a child's love. "Your wife sounds like she was wonderful," Sarah said to Grace. "David told me so many stories about how smart and funny she was." "She was," Grace agreed solemnly. "Daddy says I have her smile but his stubborn streak, which is why I always win arguments." Sarah laughed again, and David was struck by how much younger she looked when she wasn't carrying the weight of other people's expectations. "I can see that. You certainly won me over." As the evening wound down and people began making their goodbyes, David realized he was reluctant to see it end. Not because of the elegant surroundings or the excellent food, but because of the unexpected connection he'd found with someone who understood what it felt like to be perpetually between worlds. "Would you like to have coffee sometime?" Sarah asked as they gathered their things. "I mean, if you're interested. I know you're busy with work and Grace, but I thought maybe we could continue some of these conversations." David felt Grace's elbow dig into his ribs with the subtlety of a freight train. "That sounds great," he said, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. 3 months later, David stood in the same ballroom, but everything was different. The space was filled with families from the community programs Sarah's donation had funded, children and parents from dozens of different backgrounds sharing food and stories and laughter that transcended any language barriers. Grace was across the room with a group of kids, teaching them the proper way to examine butterfly wings under a magnifying glass she'd insisted on bringing. Her natural leadership skills had blossomed under the attention of adults who valued her curiosity rather than simply tolerating it. Sarah appeared at his elbow, looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of her usual business attire, and her hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail that made her look younger and more approachable. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked. "Just thinking about how different everything looks from this angle," David replied. "Same room, completely different world. Better world," Sarah said firmly. "Look at them." David followed her gaze to where children who spoke half a dozen different languages at home were working together on art projects, their parents clustering nearby in conversations that mixed English with Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, and languages David couldn't even identify. It was the kind of scene that would have been impossible to imagine at the original charity dinner, where diversity had been treated as a challenge to overcome rather than a strength to celebrate. "You did this," David said. "We did this," Sarah corrected. "All of us. Every person who decided to try harder, to listen better, to see past their first impressions." Grace appeared suddenly, as she often did, materializing between them with a butterfly sticker on her cheek and paint under her fingernails. "Sarah, Mrs. Martinez wants to know if you can help translate something for the art project. Her daughter wants to write friendship in Japanese." "Of course," Sarah said, but before she could move, Grace grabbed both their hands. "Before you go," Grace said, with the serious expression she wore when she had something important to say, "I just wanted to tell you that I'm really glad you guys are friends now. It makes Daddy happier. And it makes me happy too, because now I have someone else to teach about butterflies." David felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. Over the past few months, he'd watched his daughter bloom under the attention of adults who valued her intelligence and curiosity. He'd watched Sarah gradually shed the protective armor she'd worn for so long, revealing someone who was brilliant and funny, and unexpectedly tender with children who reminded her of herself at their age. "I'm glad too, kiddo," he said, squeezing Grace's hand. "Me three," Sarah added, and there was something in her voice that made David look at her more closely. Later, after the families had gone home and the cleanup crew had restored the ballroom to its pristine state, David and Sarah stood in the parking garage beside their cars, reluctant to end the evening. "This was good," Sarah said. "Really good. Seeing everyone together like that, seeing what's possible when people actually listen to each other." "It was," David agreed. "Though I have to admit, I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to decide this was all a mistake." Sarah studied his face in the fluorescent lighting. "Is that what you really think? That this is all a mistake?" David considered the question seriously. 3 months ago, he'd been a single father living paycheck to paycheck, focused entirely on getting through each day and making sure Grace had what she needed. Now he was part of something bigger, something that felt like it might actually make a difference in the world. "No," he said finally. "I think this might be the first thing I've done right in a long time." "Good," Sarah said, stepping closer. "Because I was thinking maybe we could make it official." "Make what official?" "The partnership between your cultural consulting work and Global Bridge's educational programs. I've been talking to the board, and they're interested in expanding the mentorship component. We could use someone who understands what it's like to be an outsider trying to find your place." David felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. It would mean travel, occasionally. Training sessions, conference presentations, that sort of thing. But it would also mean working on something that matters, something bigger than just getting by." Grace would love it, David realized. She'd been fascinated by Sarah's stories about different countries and cultures, constantly asking questions about places she wanted to visit someday. And David had forgotten what it felt like to have work that felt like purpose instead of just necessity. "What do you think?" Sarah asked, and there was vulnerability in the question that went beyond professional opportunity. David looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the intimidating CEO from that first night, but the woman who remembered Grace's birthday and sent her books about butterflies in different languages. The woman who had quietly arranged for David's car repairs to be covered by a mysterious community fund when his transmission had given out. The woman who had somehow become essential to both their lives without either of them quite noticing when it happened. "I think," David said slowly, "that some risks are worth taking." Sarah smiled, and it was the smile Grace had seen that first night, genuine and transformative and full of possibilities neither of them had dared to imagine. As they said their goodbyes and drove away in separate directions, David caught sight of Grace in his rear-view mirror, fast asleep in her car seat with a content expression on her face. She'd spent the evening surrounded by people who valued her exactly as she was, who saw her curiosity and intelligence and determination as gifts rather than inconveniences. 3 months ago, he'd walked into that charity dinner feeling like an imposter in a borrowed suit, convinced that he and Grace didn't belong in a world of wealthy donors and social causes. Tonight, he was driving home knowing that belonging wasn't something you were granted by other people. It was something you created by having the courage to be yourself, even when the world seemed designed for everyone else. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you found other people who were brave enough to do the same thing, people who understood that the most profound connections happened not when you pretended to be someone you weren't, but when you finally found the courage to show the world who you really were. Grace stirred in the back seat, mumbling something about butterflies and friendship in her sleep. David smiled, thinking about the conversation he'd have with her tomorrow, about new adventures and expanded possibilities, and the difference between fitting in and belonging. Some stories, he realized, didn't end. They just opened into bigger stories, better stories, stories worth telling. And this one, he thought as he pulled into their driveway, was just getting started.